Matthew was thrilled for his engagement party. He was finally marrying Barbara, the woman he believed would bring him happiness after many failed relationships. The luxurious hotel was filled with flowers, lights, and the finest food. Friends and family were dressed up, excited for the wealthy businessman. Matthew smiled proudly, watching Barbara mingle with guests. He thought he'd found someone who cared for him, not his money. As the night progressed, however, Matthew's sister noticed something unsettling about Barbara's behavior. While Matthew greeted his friends, his sister went to the bathroom, seeking a moment of quiet in the midst of the noisy party. Just as she was about to leave, she heard voices from one of the stalls. It was Barbara speaking to a friend. "Honestly, can you believe it?" Barbara's voice drifted out, hushed but amused. "If it wasn't for his money, I'd never be with a man like Matthew. I mean, have you seen him? I wouldn't even look twice if he wasn't rich." Her friend laughed, agreeing. "But now you're set. You're practically going to be Kumasi royalty." The two continued their conversation, laughing as if it were all a game. Matthew's sister stood frozen, her heart pounding. She had always protected her brother and knew how much he had suffered in love. She couldn't believe Barbara would say such hurtful things. Without a second thought, she rushed out of the bathroom and went straight to Matthew. Finding him in the middle of his friends, she pulled him aside and told him what she had heard. Matthew's face fell, and his expression turned dark with hurt and disappointment. Gathering his courage, he found Barbara and confronted her. As he questioned her about what he had just learned, Barbara's confident smile wavered, and the truth quickly unraveled. Faced with the undeniable evidence, Matthew felt his heart shatter. He couldn't believe that once again he had trusted someone only to be betrayed. With a heavy heart, Matthew called off the engagement on the spot. The once lively party came to an abrupt halt, and guests whispered in shock as they watched the scene unfold. Matthew, however, was too heartbroken to care about the gossip and the whispers. He turned and left the party, feeling more alone than ever. After the failed engagement, Matthew shut himself away from the world for a while. He reflected on his past, realizing that every woman he had dated had been interested in him only for his wealth. His wealth, instead of bringing him happiness, seemed to attract only those who valued money over character. As days passed, Matthew grew determined to do something drastic to find real love. He wanted someone who would see him, not his wealth. One evening he sat with his parents and shared his plan to leave Kumasi and go to Accra, where he would live as a poor man. His parents, especially his mother, were shocked and tried to talk him out of it. "But Matthew, it's dangerous," his mother pleaded, fear filling her eyes. "What if something happens to you?" Matthew shook his head, firm in his decision. "I have to do this, Mother. I can't keep living like this, not knowing if anyone loves me for me. This is the only way." Seeing his resolve, his parents reluctantly agreed, though worry remained in their hearts. They gave him their blessings, and soon after, Matthew left his life of luxury behind. He exchanged his fine clothes for simple, worn-out ones, left his house and boarded a bus to Accra, a city far enough from Kumasi that no one would recognize him. He knew he would face hardships, but he was willing to go through it if it meant finding someone who could love him for who he truly was. In Accra, Matthew's new life as a poor man was nothing like his life back in Kumasi. He traded his comfortable mansion for the rough streets, where he slept on worn mats or under makeshift shelters whenever he could find them. His expensive suits were replaced by simple torn clothes, and he now wore shoes with soles so thin he could feel every rock and crack beneath his feet. Each morning he rose with the sun and set out in search of odd jobs, anything that could earn him a few coins for food. At first Matthew struggled. The city was harsh and unforgiving, especially to someone who had never known true poverty. He worked as a labourer, hauling heavy loads for shopkeepers and cleaning stalls at the market. He felt the weight of each long day, and his body ached in ways it never had before. But he endured it, believing that this was the path he had to walk to find love. One evening, after a long day of hauling sacks of yams at the market, he met Rose, a young woman with a kind face who worked as a seamstress. She often smiled at him as he passed by her small shop, and eventually they began to exchange greetings, then brief conversations. Rose seemed genuinely interested in him, and Matthew felt his heart stir with hope. He thought perhaps she could be the one to show him true kindness. Days later, Rose invited Matthew to meet her friends, Ruth and Rita. They were seated outside a small cafe, chatting animatedly when Rose introduced him. Ruth and Rita exchanged glances, raising their brows as they took in Matthew's worn clothes and dusty sandals. Matthew greeted them politely, but their smiles were thin, almost mocking. "Is he your friend?" Ruth asked, her eyes filled with amusement. Rose nodded but shifted uncomfortably under their stares. Rita leaned in, whispering just loud enough for Matthew to hear. "He looks like he hasn't had a proper bath in days. Are you serious, Rose?" Rose's cheeks flushed, and she avoided Matthew's gaze. The following day she avoided him altogether, and soon she broke things off. Matthew walked away with a heavy heart, realizing once again that his simple appearance and lack of wealth had cost him the chance to be loved. But he wasn't ready to give up. He was determined to keep searching. Days turned into weeks, and Matthew continued to struggle. Some nights he went to bed hungry, unable to earn enough for a single meal. His once strong spirit began to waver, and he wondered if he had made a mistake in leaving his old life. But despite his doubts, he kept going, clinging to the hope that love could still find him. One evening, after a particularly hard day, Matthew wandered the streets, weak with hunger. As he passed by a modest restaurant, the smell of food made his stomach growl. Desperate, he approached the restaurant door, hoping he could beg for a small plate of leftover food. Inside, the restaurant was busy, with customers talking and laughing as they enjoyed their meals. Matthew's mouth watered, and he swallowed his pride, stepping inside to ask for help. The restaurant was run by a woman named Patricia, a stern-looking woman who kept a close eye on everyone. She had 3 daughters, Ruth and Rita, her biological daughters, and Irene, her stepdaughter. Patricia had married Irene's father after Irene's mother had passed away. At first, she pretended to be kind, especially when Irene's father was around. As soon as Irene's father passed, Patricia changed completely. The once small hidden acts of cruelty turned open and relentless. She also squandered all the money that she had inherited from Irene's father. Irene was forced to wake up before dawn to clean the entire house, scrub floors, and wash laundry by hand, while her stepsisters, Ruth and Rita, slept in their warm beds. If anything wasn't spotless, Patricia would scold her loudly, her voice full of anger. Sometimes she would even grab Irene's arm harshly, pulling her back to redo the work as she pointed out each tiny speck of dust she claimed to see. At the restaurant, Patricia put Irene to work without pay, making her carry heavy bags, clean dirty tables, and handle the hottest pots in the kitchen. While her stepsisters laughed and served customers, Irene was left with the hard, thankless jobs, her hands raw and sore from scrubbing dishes until her fingers ached. Ruth and Rita would mock her, calling her the servant and giving her mean looks if she dared to sit down for even a moment's rest. On cold nights, Patricia would give Irene only thin, worn blankets and a hard mat to sleep on, while her own daughters slept on soft mattresses. Irene was forced to eat the leftover scraps, sometimes waiting until her stomach ached while Patricia and her daughters dined on fresh food. Patricia would tell Irene she was lucky to even have a roof over her head, warning her that if she ever complained, she could be thrown out onto the streets. When around customers, Patricia would often insult Irene, pointing out any mistake, no matter how small, in front of others. She would say things like, "This girl doesn't know how to do anything right," or "If only she could be more like Ruth and Rita," deliberately lowering Irene's spirits and making her feel small and unwanted. As the years passed, Irene grew used to the endless demands, but the pain in her heart never left. She learned to keep her head down, speak softly, and obey without question. This was the only life Irene knew, a life filled with pain and sadness. On the day that Matthew entered the restaurant, Irene was busy cleaning the tables as usual. Inside, Matthew saw Ruth and Rita again. They worked in the restaurant alongside their mother, Patricia, who ran the business. Their laughter stopped as soon as they saw him. "Isn't that the man who was following Rose around?" Ruth whispered, nudging Rita. The two of them smirked as he entered, casting him looks of disdain. Patricia, noticing his ragged appearance, crossed her arms and glared. "We don't feed beggars here. Out you go," she snapped, her voice sharp. Matthew's face flushed with embarrassment, and he backed out of the restaurant, feeling the weight of their judgment. But not everyone inside shared their cruelty. Late that night, as the restaurant closed and the lights dimmed, a slender figure crept outside, holding a bundle wrapped in a cloth. It was Irene, Ruth and Rita's stepsister. She had seen the way they'd treated Matthew and couldn't bear it. She quietly approached him, her eyes kind and understanding, and held out the bundle. "I brought you some leftovers," she said softly, offering him a gentle smile. Matthew's eyes widened in surprise, and he accepted the food, grateful beyond words. "Thank you." "Irene, right?" he asked, trying to recall her name from earlier conversations he'd overheard. She nodded, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "Don't thank me. Just eat," she replied, a soft warmth in her tone. From that night onward, Irene would sneak him food whenever she could, slipping him bread, rice, or pieces of grilled fish left over from the day. Their conversations started simply, awkwardly. They spoke of little things, how the day had gone, the weather, or a funny incident in the market. But over time, Matthew found himself opening up to her in ways he never had with anyone else. She listened, really listened, without judgment or expectation. And though Irene's life was full of hardship, there was a quiet strength in her that Matthew admired. One evening, as Irene handed him a bowl of stew, she sat down beside him, letting out a tired sigh. "You must be careful," she said softly. "If my stepmother finds out what I've been doing, she'll make things worse for me." Matthew looked at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Why do you keep helping me if it puts you at risk?" Irene smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Because I know what it's like to have no one." As their friendship grew, so did the risk. One night, Patricia caught Irene slipping out of the restaurant with food in hand. Furious, she dragged Irene back inside, her voice loud enough to shake the walls. "You ungrateful girl," she screamed. "After everything I've done for you, you're stealing from me to feed some beggar." Irene stood silent, her head bowed, but Matthew could see the tears welling up in her eyes from where he stood outside, helpless. He wanted to rush in, to defend her, but he knew that would only make things worse. The next day, Irene was gone. Days passed, and Matthew noticed Irene's absence. Concerned, he went back to the restaurant and asked about her. When he arrived at the restaurant, Ruth and Rita's sneers added to his concern. "She's gone," they said coldly, their disdain apparent as they dismissed him with a wave. "Thrown out. She's not welcome here anymore." Determined to find her, Matthew searched the streets until, one evening, he spotted Irene sitting alone by a market stall, looking lost and defeated. When he saw her, his heart broke, knowing she had been cast out because of him. Taking her hand, he led her to a small apartment, claiming it belonged to his boss. In reality, it was his own, but he wanted her to feel comfortable and safe. As the days passed, Irene grew stronger, and her friendship with Matthew deepened. They shared quiet meals, talked late into the night, and soon Matthew realized that his feelings for her had shifted. What had once been simple kindness grew into something more, something he hadn't expected. He had fallen in love with her, not just for her strength and resilience, but for the way she saw him, truly saw him, as a man, not a fortune. One evening, after a long day of work, Matthew made up his mind. He wanted to marry Irene, to give her the life she deserved, far from the cruelty of her stepmother and the hardships she had faced. But first he needed to go through the proper channels. He knew that in their tradition a bride price must be paid, and for that he would need to speak to Patricia, no matter how much he disliked her. Matthew's heart raced as he approached Patricia's restaurant. The air was thick with the smell of cooking oil and spices, and voices from inside floated out, mingling with the sounds of bustling streets. Standing at the entrance, he took a deep breath, gathering his courage. Today he would ask Patricia for Irene's hand in marriage. He knew Irene was his true love. She had been by his side when no one else would look at him. She had given him kindness when he had nothing. Inside, Patricia was wiping a table, her expression sharp as she directed her daughters, Ruth and Rita, who carried trays to waiting customers. When she saw Matthew, her brows knitted together, and her lips twisted into a tight line. She recognized him as the poor man who had been hanging around her restaurant, the one her stepdaughter had foolishly helped. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold and dismissive. Matthew swallowed hard, glancing around before stepping closer. "I'm here to ask for Irene's hand in marriage," he said, his voice steady despite the anger brewing in Patricia's eyes. Patricia burst into laughter, the sound sharp and cruel. She looked him up and down, as though sizing up his worth, and smirked. "You want to marry Irene? A poor labourer like you? And what will you give me for her?" She placed her hands on her hips, her gaze challenging. "If you want to marry her, bring me 50 bags of rice, 10 goats, and 100 yards of fine cloth. And that's just the start." Ruth and Rita, standing nearby, snickered, sharing a glance of amusement. They clearly believed the demand was impossible, but Matthew only nodded. "I will bring everything you've asked for," he replied, his voice firm. Patricia raised an eyebrow, looking at him as if he were a fool. "Go ahead then," she said with a dismissive wave, "but don't come back unless you have everything." Matthew left the restaurant without another word, his jaw clenched. Over the next week, he gathered every item Patricia had demanded, using his own wealth to fulfill her outrageous request. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the streets of Accra as Matthew made his way back to Patricia's restaurant. Behind him, a small procession followed, carrying 50 bags of rice, 10 goats tied to ropes, and rolls of fine cloth stacked neatly on a cart. Curious onlookers gathered around, murmuring as they recognized him as the poor labourer they had seen around the neighbourhood. Inside the restaurant, Patricia was busy directing Ruth and Rita as they cleaned tables and refilled condiments. She looked up when she heard the commotion outside. Her eyes narrowed as she caught sight of Matthew at the entrance, and then widened when she saw the goods behind him. For a brief moment, she was speechless. What is all this?" Patricia stammered, her voice filled with disbelief. Matthew stepped forward, meeting her gaze with a steady, unflinching look. "I brought everything you asked for, Patricia," he replied. "The rice, the goats, the cloth, every last item." Patricia's mouth dropped open as she scanned the procession, her mind struggling to make sense of the scene. Ruth and Rita peeked from behind her, their eyes wide with surprise. They exchanged glances, clearly unsettled. Recovering quickly, Patricia forced a smile, though it didn't hide the calculating gleam in her eyes. She glanced back at Matthew, now with a different plan in mind. "Well, Matthew, it seems you have hidden talents," she said slowly, her tone suddenly sweet. "With all that you have, I think it's clear you should be with someone who matches your status." She turned to Ruth, who straightened and gave Matthew a practiced, charming smile. "Ruth would make a fine wife for a man like you. She's beautiful, educated, and, unlike Irene, she knows how to behave in society." Ruth smiled wider, stepping forward, eager to impress. She reached out a hand toward Matthew, her fingers elegantly stretched as though inviting him to take her hand. But Matthew didn't move. Instead, he kept his eyes on Patricia, his face unreadable but firm. "No, Patricia," he replied, his voice calm but unwavering. "I came here to ask for Irene's hand, not Ruth's. Irene has been kind to me when I had nothing. She looked at me as a person, not a wallet. She is the one I want to marry." The sweetness faded from Patricia's face in an instant, replaced by a look of cold anger. She clenched her fists, her shoulders tense, and her voice took on a hard edge. "You want to marry Irene, that simple, uneducated girl?" She glanced at Ruth and Rita, both of whom glared at Matthew with resentment. "You're making a mistake, Matthew. A man of your wealth deserves better." Matthew held his ground. "I am certain of my choice, Patricia. I came here because I wanted to honor you as her only family and ask for your blessing." Patricia's face twisted with fury, and for a moment she was silent, struggling to keep her voice steady. She took a deep breath, then sneered. "No," she spat, her words laced with bitterness. "You can't have her. I won't accept your bride price." Matthew stared at her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He hadn't expected this. He thought the money and gifts would be enough to settle the matter. But Patricia's greed and pride had taken over, and now she was standing in the way of his happiness. As he turned to leave, determination burned within him. He wasn't going to give up. Not on Irene. Matthew's determination to marry Irene never wavered, despite the many obstacles Patricia threw in his path. He visited her several times, hoping that she would eventually accept his bride price and give her blessing, but each time Patricia's stubbornness only grew. She refused to let Irene marry him, not out of concern for her stepdaughter's well-being, but because of her own pride and bitterness. To her, the idea of a wealthy man choosing Irene over Ruth or Rita was an insult she couldn't bear. As months passed, Matthew realized that waiting for Patricia's approval was futile. He loved Irene deeply and was not willing to let her go because of her stepmother's selfishness. After many long conversations with Irene, they made a difficult decision. They would marry without Patricia's blessing. Their wedding was simple, held in a small gathering with a few friends under the open sky. There were no fancy decorations, no expensive clothes, just the warmth of those who truly cared about them. Matthew looked into Irene's eyes as they exchanged vows, feeling a sense of peace and joy he had never known. After the ceremony, Matthew led Irene to a car waiting nearby. He had been careful to keep his true identity hidden throughout their time together, but now, as husband and wife, he felt it was time for the truth. The car drove them north, away from the noise and bustle of Accra toward Kumasi. When they finally arrived at the grand gates of Matthew's mansion, Irene's eyes widened in shock. The large estate sprawled before her, with manicured lawns, towering trees, and a mansion that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was nothing like the small apartment she had known. She turned to Matthew, confusion and hurt flashing in her eyes. "Matthew, is this yours?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, watching her reaction closely. "Yes, Irene. This is my home. I didn't want you to know at first, but now there are no more secrets between us." Irene looked at him, her eyes filled with wonder and understanding. She took a deep breath, then nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I loved you when you had nothing, Matthew," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. "That won't change now." As she stepped through the door and into her new life, Matthew felt his heart swell with joy. He had found love, not in riches or appearances, but in the pure, honest kindness of a woman who had seen him for who he truly was. They started their new life together, building a home filled with love and trust. One evening, a messenger arrived at the mansion. He handed Irene an envelope, sealed with a stamp from a lawyer's office. Inside, there was a letter written in her father's handwriting, something she hadn't seen since he passed away. She held her breath as she read his familiar, neat script. "Irene, my beloved daughter," the letter began. "I feared the time would come when you might suffer in ways I could not protect you from. If you're reading this, it means you have finally found a safe, happy place in life. I knew Patricia might not treat you kindly, so I secured a portion of my wealth under your name. I trust that one day you will claim it when you no longer have to live under her roof." Irene's eyes filled with tears as she continued to read, her hand trembling. She had never expected her father to leave her anything, given how Patricia had always said he left them with nothing. But as she finished the letter, she realized her father had planned everything, leaving her money that Patricia couldn't touch. Following the instructions in the letter, Matthew and Irene visited the lawyer's office the next day. There they learned the full details of the hidden account her father had left for her. The amount was far greater than Irene could have ever imagined, making her wealthier than even Matthew. For a moment she felt overwhelmed by it all, the wealth, the responsibility. But Matthew held her hand, steady and reassuring. With Matthew's support, she decided to use part of the money to help those in need, remembering the times when she herself had been without a single coin. Together, they began planning small projects around the city, offering food and shelter to those who, like Matthew once had, struggled to make it through each day. Meanwhile, back in Accra, Patricia's life took a sharp turn for the worse. Her health, which had been declining for some time, continued to deteriorate. Her once sharp mind became clouded, and her body grew weaker with each passing day. Ruth and Rita, who had always relied on their mother to manage the restaurant, found themselves overwhelmed by the responsibility. Without Patricia's guidance, the business began to falter. Ruth, who had spent most of her life expecting things to be handed to her, struggled to run the day-to-day operations. Rita, who had never bothered to learn the skills necessary to help, was equally lost. Customers stopped coming, dissatisfied with the service and food quality that had once been handled by Patricia. The money dwindled, debts piled up, and soon the restaurant was forced to close its doors. With no source of income and no skills to fall back on, Ruth and Rita found themselves in a dire situation. The comfortable life they had known slipped through their fingers, and they were left with nothing. Their pride, which had once been so strong, could not save them from the reality of poverty. The sisters, who had once looked down on Irene and mocked Matthew, now faced the harshness of life they had never imagined. Patricia, bedridden and weak, watched helplessly as everything she had built crumbled around her. She had driven Irene away, believing that her own daughters were more deserving of a good life. But in the end, it was Irene who had found happiness, while Ruth and Rita were left to struggle in the ruins of their mother's decisions. In the end, Irene and Matthew's love story was not just about wealth or status. It was about resilience, compassion, and finding joy in the most unexpected places. They had built a life together, free from the greed and bitterness that had once threatened to destroy them. And as they lived on in their mansion, they never forgot where they had come from, staying humble, grounded, and, most importantly, deeply in love. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more great content. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to share this video with someone who might enjoy it too. See you in the next one.